and welcome to the February Conservative Women's Network. I'm Michelle Easton, president of the Clare, Boothe, Luce Center for Conservative Women, and I want to thank you all for coming. And thank you to C-SPAN Book TV for covering this excellent author and important new book. The Conservative Women's Network began 22 years ago. This lady here, Becky Norton Dunlop, called me and said, we need to do something to promote our most accomplished women and their important messages. And she said, we need to do this every month. And so we started 22 years ago, and we're still doing it. What kind of women like today's speaker? Stella Morabito. I'm going to speak today on this issue, how power elites weaponize the fear of loneliness to enforce social conformity. That's her new book, The Weaponization of Loneliness. The message Stella shares is so important to all, and especially to the focus of this institute, because future women leaders, now in schools and colleges, they're often told implicitly and sometimes explicitly that if they express their conservative views, they'll be isolated and shunned. And that's what happens to a lot of them. That's why our mission here at the Luce Center is to prepare them for future leadership by introducing them to other similarly situated young women so they're not lonely, they have conservative friends, give them deeper knowledge on the critical issues, and develop in them more of the confidence and courage that they need to stand up and speak out. It's just so easy for students at the mostly left-wing schools and colleges to just pretend they agree with all the leftist, socialist, wacky ideas that these institutions are promoting. Stella fearlessly encourages fellow Americans to speak out politely but strongly in support of their conservative values and not let the left silence them. Stella tells how one person can make a huge difference and how partnering, even just one person, it can shatter the illusion that everyone has the same left-wing opinion. Her book gives a lot of detail on how the powerful elites try to silence conservative and their ideas by utilizing these fear tactics, like the fear of isolation and social rejection. In addition to this book, Stella has published numerous great articles at the Federalist, where she's been a senior contributor since 2014. She's also written a lot of good articles for the Washington Examiner, Townhall, Human Life Review, American Greatness, Public Discourse, to name just a few. And she has her own blog where she writes on today's current issues. She's also been featured on multiple podcasts, most recently The Laura Ingraham Show and Ben Dominich's Fox News podcast, as well as many other events. Stella served for a decade as an analyst at the Central Intelligence Agency, where she focused on methods of communist media, propaganda, and disinformation. She has a master's degree in Russian and Soviet history from the University of Southern California and now resides in the Shenandoah Valley with her husband, Brian. Following today's talk, and we'll do some questions and answers, Stella's book will be available to purchase right out here for $15. I know some of you have already bought it. And she's kindly offered to sign copies of her book for you, personalize them or whatever you like. And after that, we'll ask you to join us, if you like, for lunch in the next room as well. Please join me now in welcoming Stella Morabito.
Wow, thank you, Michelle, for that really thorough and beautiful introduction. I so much appreciate it. And thank you for this tremendous honor. I'm grateful and so privileged to have this opportunity to speak at the Clare, Boothe, Luce Center for Conservative Women. And I've always deeply admired your work and your principles and, of course, your magnificent namesake here. And it's so good to see all of you, so many familiar faces. So I wrote this book, The Weaponization of Loneliness, because I believe that human isolation is the greatest threat to freedom. But I don't believe most people have a conscious grasp of that fact, and I don't think they see the fight for freedom in that light. And it's critical that we do so. The breakdown of human bonds makes us extremely vulnerable to tyranny. So in my following remarks, I'm going to make 5 main points. First, imposed isolation is the primary means of social control. Second, and to help us understand that connection between isolation and social control, I'm going to describe something I call the machinery of loneliness. My third point is that the most dangerous output of that machinery is conformity, social conformity, and self-censorship. Fourth, if we do nothing to push back against that impulse to self-censor, we invite more isolation, and with that comes the destruction of personal relationships, the destruction of freedom. But finally, the good news is that we have the power to control the impulse to conform and to renew civil society. So my first and central point is that imposed isolation is the primary means of social control. When I use the term tyrant, I'm going to use that a lot, I mean anyone trying to impose control over others against their will or against their better judgment. Tyrants always first isolate their subjects in order to control them. That's a recurring pattern, though they may not be conscious of it. That's what they do. And this imposed isolation can be mental, emotional, or physical. And the impulse can be found at every level of tyranny. For example, a gaslighting partner in a one-on-one relationship does it, but so does a schoolyard bully or a toxic boss or a dangerous cult leader. And dictators, of course, who take over whole societies are the experts in this. But isolation is always key. In fact, in her epic work called The Origins of Totalitarianism, the political philosopher Hannah Arendt wrote that the primary concern of all tyrannical government is to isolate people against one another. Why? Well, because a healthy society of functioning families, strong faith communities, and joyful friendships cannot easily be ruled by terror. People gain inner strength from those bonds of loyalty and love. They become creative. They become inventive. Power actually becomes decentralized in those circumstances. And that's exactly why totalitarian systems work to atomize people, to separate them. We can see these effects today even in family brokenness, in the war on religion, and of course the war on free speech. So the question is, why do we fall for this? And how did they get away with it? Well, they exploit human nature. Human beings are hardwired to connect with other people. We just can't survive in severe isolation. We crave connection in order to live fulfilling lives. But the flip side of this need to connect is a primal fear of being ostracized, of being turned into a social reject or outcast, of being humiliated. And that's a huge vulnerability in us. And tyrants easily exploit it in order to extract compliance and conformity with their narrative. So they intimidate their victims with mobs and with smear words that define them as evil or deplorable or less than human. Bystanders who witness such bullying are the great majority. The victims are really kind of the minority to be the example for all the rest of society as bystanders. And they tend to be frantic about avoiding the same fate as the victims. So the dirty little secret here, though, is that as more of us comply, expecting to get relief from ostracism, we only dig ourselves in deeper into isolation. We dig all of society in deeper, and that's the great irony of it all. Just look at the COVID mandates to see how social pressures serve to separate us. First of all, with COVID, our isolation was actually enforced in a very obvious way that we never before saw in America. Not only were we ordered to literally stay apart from one another, but we were ordered to remain faceless as well, covering our faces everywhere, which in itself is a dehumanizing thing. So if you objected at any point, you risked being called selfish or uncaring or even a murderer. And the COVID mandates were actually reinforced by a media monopoly that smeared any differing voice as disinformation that endangered lives. So COVID mandates also gave Americans their first real taste of what a social credit system is like. And that's a system currently in place in communist China where your access to goods and services depends entirely upon your political compliance. For example, you needed to get an injection to keep your job. You needed to show papers to go to a restaurant or to go to a concert or even to get on a plane or train. People were cut off from even seeking solace in a house of worship. Worse, mandates were promoted by the media in a way that cultivated hostilities where no hostilities even existed before. Friendships were destroyed. In many families, you needed an injection to come to Thanksgiving dinner or see the grandchildren or even the children. Then there was the official, I call it sadism, of forcing loved ones to die alone. Just horrible, brutal. So how did Americans get to the point of tolerating such things? Well, if we dig beneath the surface, we can see how tyrants operate what I call a machinery of loneliness, which generates our compliance and pulls us apart. So think of our primal fear of loneliness as the spark that ignites that machine's fuel. The fuel that keeps it going is our natural conformity impulse and the self-censorship that comes from that. And the machine has three main components that tyrants operate. Identity politics, number one, political correctness, and then mob agitation. I call them the three-legged stool of tyranny. Identity politics strips away our individuality as just unique human persons, divides us into hostile groups, assigned the labels of oppressor or victim. Political correctness induces self-censorship by threatening us with rejection and ridicule if we don't accept the narrative. Mobs then enforce all of this by escalating the threats. And a mob can be anything from Antifa running riot to a woke human resources department to a swarm of social media trolls. The machinery of loneliness has other levers and buttons that include snitch culture, the criminalization of comedy, I think we're familiar with that, struggle sessions, false confessions, and more. All of these are social engineering tools that exploit our fear of loneliness to trigger that conformity impulse. But the common denominator of all of these components of the machinery is demonization. We constantly hear demonizing smear words that circulate in the media. Yeah, a little, but you know, they can be both, I guess. It's a long list of words, but they're all meant to scare people into either shutting up or lying about what they believe. A short list includes smears like, you've heard them all, bigot, hater, white supremacist, fascist, domestic terrorist, terrorist, this phobic, that phobic, or anti-vaxxer. My personal favorite, conspiracy theorist. But there are also groupings of these smear words like COVID denier, climate denier, election denier. And those are all designed to echo the very real evil of Holocaust denial. So you see what they're doing there. All are used ad hominem and are meant to cut off real conversation. But these methods aren't new. We've seen them play out in modern history, from the French Revolution's Jacobin reign of terror, in the Bolshevik Revolution's war on private life, Nazi Germany's racial hygiene program, and Mao's murderous Cultural Revolution. So these methods continue to play out today in our own nation, and now with a globalist agenda. And the goals of these agendas are also the same as before, not just the methods, but the goals. The goals are to establish a new world order, a new utopia, and even a new type of human being that can be controlled by the power elites. But three things are different today. First, the reach is now global. It's not restricted to some region like Russia or China. And second, new communications technologies have an exponentially greater reach, but not just across national borders. They also have a great reach within each individual person. The internet, social media, our devices, the metaverse, they all have an alienating effect, drawing people into a virtual world and away from real face-to-face conversation. So The third point, the third thing that's different from the past is that there's no single demagogue that leads the charge in the, like a Mao or a Lenin. What we have today instead is a hydra-headed beast that includes players in big tech, big media, big government, the corporate world, and more. Now, each of these players may have their own special interests, but they all share a common outlook, a common psychology, so that they often appear to be working in concert. For example, they all claim to know what's best for you and that you must obey. And the key element in that obedience is political censorship. I'm not talking about, other kinds of censorship like protecting children from pornography. I'm talking about political censorship and being able to explore the world of ideas. So before I wrote this book, I wondered, is there a common thread that ties all of these insane agendas we're seeing together? They seem to have proliferated like a game of whack-a-mole. I mean, all of these, you see sexualization of children by the education establishment. We see critical race theory that promotes hostility between people. The electoral process looks like a farce in so many places. Double standards are replacing due process in law. And then there's that Orwellian slogan, speech is violence, or free speech is hate speech. So how many, and there's so many more destructive agendas, but how did they all come to pass? Well, it didn't happen overnight. It happened after decades, I believe, of too many people succumbing to political correctness and self-silencing. That's the common thread. Again, we self-censor as a way of avoiding the threat of rejection for being politically incorrect. And I realize that this audience is less shy than most about speaking up. But no one's immune. I mean, even U.S. senators will forsake their stated principles in order to avoid being called mean names. This happens with judges too, celebrities, and so on. It's a very powerful impulse that can easily be exploited. Most people will comply, especially if too few push back and speak out. And I don't think people grasp how really dangerous self-censorship is. The more that good people shut up about what they believe, the more they deny others exposure to their point of view. And that silence creates a vacuum, and things have been written about this, for destructive agendas to rush in and pose as mainstream agendas. So whenever we self-censor, even one-on-one, we are shaping public opinion. I don't know if you've thought of that, but we're helping to build a spiral of silence about what we believe. And this can push a normal and healthy viewpoint to the fringes, and at the same time, a really fringy agenda can end up being treated like conventional wisdom. Media monopolies then regurgitate the propaganda while also canceling anyone who goes against it. This conditioned reaction to self-censor also paves the way for top-down censorship. Social engineers are now trying to tell us that free speech is dangerous. Well, of course they're saying that. An open marketplace of ideas has always blocked their path to real power, and that's why the regulation of speech is such a top priority for them. It's why you saw former CNN anchor Brian Stelter chairing a panel at Davos last month, claiming that misinformation is the clear and present danger to democracy, and ditto for those old Twitter execs that were testifying. Self-censorship has given a lot of oxygen to crazy notions, including an un-American idea like setting up that misinformation governance board. So social control freaks will tell you what you can and can't think and say. They'll seek to destroy you if you defy them. But to cement their power, this point we have to just remember it and cleave it to our hearts, they must destroy our sources of strength and independence. That means our private lives, our personal relationships, our faith traditions are standing in their way. And that's exactly why the left has conducted a war on family at least since 1848, when the Communist Manifesto proclaimed very, very bluntly, abolish the family. I mean, that's a main point. And the war on religion went right along with that. So we need to recognize this is a war on all private life, on all private conversation, on friendship and on faith that might keep us independent of the mass state. And it also is a war on our path to developing those relationships, which is the war on free speech. So let me try to drive this point home. If we can't speak freely to one another, can we sustain personal relationships? The answer is no. If we're always terrified of the consequences of thinking out loud, can we really get to even know anyone? The answer is no. If everybody has to shut up and obey some overlord, can we maintain a civil society? No. History bears this out. Distrust and surveillance in tyrannical states get so intense that betrayal of family and friends is common in them. So this war has always targeted the mediating institutions of society as the big prize, because those institutions, family, faith, community, real community, are the buffer zones between the individual and the mass state. After all the other institutions have been hijacked, the private sphere is all that's left. Now, the private sphere is still standing today, but it's very wobbly because there's been a lot of brokenness that's accumulated over the generations. That makes a lot of people increasingly vulnerable and dependent. And I think this is especially true for women and youth. Consider, for example, that unmarried women in the November midterms broke by a margin of 37 points for candidates who promote a daddy state. Now, recall that Life of Julia infographic from 10 years ago. It was a campaign device meant to woo that group of women. It showed a cardboard cutout woman named Julia, taken care of by the state from cradle to grave. She had no marriage, no family cohesion, and in this isolation, she was actually depicted as dependent of the government. And it reminds me of Stockholm Syndrome, where the captive bonds with a captor because they're isolated, powerless, and simply hope to be taken care of. That's how it works. So this all seems pretty bleak. So how do we resist? How do we try to fix it? Well, if you go away with just one conclusion today, I hope you'll think more about the incredible power that just one bold voice can have. The renowned sociologist Jacques Ellul wrote that propaganda ends where simple dialogue begins. This means that one-on-one open conversation is far more powerful than most realize, and that's exactly why propagandists constantly try to shut it down. They instinctively seem to understand that the hidden sphere of life is really the epicenter of freedom, because freedom is nurtured first through that private sphere of family, faith, and community. It then can ripple outward into society at large. So the antidote to the poison of tyranny and isolation is to restore relationships one by one and talk to one another a lot. This is an asymmetric war now because we can't depend on corrupted institutions, most of them are all corrupted, for any help with that. We can only begin by resolving to speak openly to one another in a way that triggers a cascade of open conversation and what are called parallel policies, parallel communities that take the place of those corrupted institutions. And to remember that free speech is really a use it or lose it proposition. Imagine millions of people speaking fearlessly about what they believe and millions of open conversations and civil discourse. That would feed on itself and tyranny wouldn't stand a chance. That's because when you speak up, and you might have experienced this, you embolden others to speak up too. It's how we discover that we aren't alone. And the fruits of open discourse are so abundant. For example, think about the impact of just one word or one idea that was conveyed to you in the past that made you realize that you weren't alone in what you thought. Or maybe it sparked your thought processes and creativity. Maybe someone encouraged you at a time when you were feeling desperate, but that person helped pave the way. Words of truth spoken one-on-one, even one-on-one, have a way of reverberating throughout generations. They build on themselves, and they can and do change the course of history. But conversely, when our conscience tells us to speak up, but we shut up instead, we all become more isolated. We lose potential in relationships, we lose knowledge and freedom. So if we can build more awareness of these dynamics, more people can detect the patterns in the weaponization of loneliness and not fall prey to them. We'd be better equipped to guard and defend our loyalties of family, of faith, and of friends, which are the true sources of our power. But fewer people today are blessed with such support systems that they can fall back on, so they're extremely vulnerable. That means that those of us who are blessed with these connections must lead the way with courage. It doesn't take a majority to get started. Some say just 3%, 5%. But we need to speak out and reach out to help repair the brokenness around us and draw others into the fold of freedom. And when I think of the prospect of such a cascade of freedom, I'm reminded of that pearl of wisdom from Clare Boothe Luce. Courage is the ladder on which all the other virtues mount. We need to take that to heart. Thank you so much for this opportunity to talk to you today. I look forward to your questions. Thank you. Aww. Yeah, oh yeah, I'll take questions. Oh, it's okay. You can tell I got friends. Oh, I dropped your watch. Thank you. Oh, thank you.
What a great audience.
Yes.
We have
my.
a little time for questions and answers. Lindsay in the back has the microphone. Lindsay, by the way, thank you for setting this up and doing such a great job with CWN. Lindsay Cruz, she's my assistant.
Wonderful. Thank you, Lindsay.
If you would, there you go. If you would not mind stating your name and if you have an affiliation.
Is that on? I don't hear it.
Lindsay, is that on?
No.
There you go. Yeah. Gail Weiss, political refugee from Montgomery County, Maryland, like you are.
Oh, yeah. Me too. Me too.
I know.
Yeah.
I know. I was wondering if you could give an example over the last 2 or 3 years of this COVID insanity of anything that you personally did to say no. I can give one. When my husband and I were thrilled to be able to vote for Youngkin here, and we voted early voting, and they were offering us a mask when we went into the voting place. And I said, no, thank you. And the young man at the door, couldn't say anything. My husband smartly said, it probably would have been voter disenfranchisement if they had barred people from being able to enter. And my husband said that he noticed it trickled back down the line of other people waiting to get in. They were also saying, no, thank you. So I was just wondering if you had any example that you can share personally.
Well, personally, I have a similar example. I was in a building, and it wasn't even that long ago. It was a couple months ago. One of these buildings that absolutely required masks, even when most didn't anymore. And I was going to the elevator, and apparently one of the elevators was broken, and so there were a whole group of people, and I saw that they required masks, and they had a guard, and I didn't want to. I was just looking for the stairway because I wasn't going to stand. Well, the guard went, hey. And he hands me a basket where I'm supposed to pick up a mask. And, well, I didn't. I said, I said, that's BS. But I didn't say BS. I said, that's bull. And I said, no, I'm not doing that. That's bullshit. But what was really interesting, just like you said, his reaction was to say, well, I know it's bullshit, but you got to wear it. And all these masked people around the elevator, were like, I said, just tell me where the stairway is. He said, I can have it thrown out of the building. I said, yeah. Okay, where's the stairway? And I just went on my way. And that was that. But it was just really interesting because it exposed the insanity of it. I mean, he agreed with me publicly. And he was the guard. So it was just an interesting interaction, but it did take a little bit of, on my part, a little bit of nerve, but I was just so sick of it. I mean, I think people reach a point at which they realize this is just, this is social control, social engineering. So sorry to use a bad word there.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
My name is Mike Albin. I'm with the Fairfax County Taxpayers Alliance. And
okay.
You mentioned in order to generate this this condition that we're in, it does not take a Saddam or a Mao or a Hitler to generate it. Who were the founding fathers of this current woke movement? This enemy that we see on the campuses, for example, or around the society in general, didn't start from nothing. Who planted the seeds? even if there was no single leader that we can point to.
Yeah.
Who were the founding fathers of this movement?
Well, in my book, thank you so much for that question. In my book, I do have a chapter on the totalitarian impulse, and it's ancient. I mean, I think you go back to the Garden of Eden, people want to be God. But this, in the modern era, this has been going on for a long time. There's a really good book by Michael Walsh called The Devil's Pleasure Palace that talks about the Frankfurt School and how a lot of these academics from Frankfurt in the 1930s came over to mostly Columbia University, and it was all cultural Marxist movement. And it goes back even further with the Italian communist Antonio Gramsci, who stated that this economic thing, the blue collar, they're not really going along with this. People like to just go home and, they're happy, with their jobs and life. So what do we have to do? And the idea was this long march. Well, later on, that term got coined by a German revolutionary, Boothe was his name. But the long march through the institutions. Take over, first of all, academia to begin with, because once you control education, you control all, the credentialing that goes into all the other institutions. And so who were they? I mean, you could look at the Frankfurt School. One of the, big ones was Herbert Marcuse. And he was a mentor to Angela Davis. I mean, it's all about destruction of the cultural, of Western civilization and freedom. And it goes back to that totalitarian impulse, where it's almost psychopathic, I think. They've got this, it's like a superhuman stamina that they seem to have to just keep pushing to do what? Destabilize children about their identities, destabilize all of society. And that's really what it's about: deconstruction, destabilization, and this kind of urge for power. But the founding fathers, I mean, if you look at the Frankfurt School, that only goes back like not even 100 years, but it's all part and parcel of a very ancient impulse, I think.
Hi, I'm Tina Cody, and I'm here with no affiliation. The message I'm hearing from your talk is, of course, leading by example and having personal courage, but I'm wondering what you might suggest for a more systemic approach. As a mother of a 12-year-old daughter, I'm wondering what we can do to help inspire the young women who are currently in college to be their authentic selves in the face of the communities that they're facing.
Yeah. I talk about how local focus is so important. I mean, not just, the network of family and all of that, but if you look at school board elections that have been low-hanging fruit for the far left for a very long time, and they use that to move up the ladder. But personal courage, and of course you mentioned youth on college campuses, especially young women. Michelle here wrote a book called How to Raise a Conservative Daughter. I think you might pick that one up also. But of course, I suppose you could. Well, you did give a talk about how you can build that sense of confidence. But it's all based on a chain reaction. I mean, Michelle, in her introduction, a very kind introduction, mentioned a piece in my book where I talk about the conformity impulse and the power of partnering. Solomon Asch in the 1950s did this fascinating experiment. It had nothing, there was nothing controversial in how the subjects were supposed to react. They were just supposed to match up the length of a line from a choice of 3 different lines, and the answer was obvious. It was like, they called it an exercise in visual judgment. The subject tended to go along when all of the other collaborators of the experiment gave the wrong answer. And there was nothing controversial about it. It was just that sense of publicly having to announce, oh, it's line 2, but everybody else says line 3, you know. But what he did, he replicated this experiment many, many times, 1,000 times or whatever. And what he found, and he did variations, and one of the variations should give us a lot of hope, and that's that when we partner with someone else, when that subject was given a partner, when all the others were saying the wrong answer, conformity dropped like a rock. Just having one other voice out there. Now, of course, all the others in another, you know, in a situation where, you know, they're going to be ridiculed and all of that are meant to shut you up so that the effect of the partnering doesn't take root. But if we tune into this and use strategies to, you know, build on that, I think, you know, it's extremely helpful. People get a lot of relief. They feel liberated when they realize they can express what they really believe and not have to live this, you know, in this crazy woke empire.
Donna Jackson from Project 21 Black Leadership Network. One of the things I get so angry about is when I hear people get accused of white supremacy and I've been called the black face of white supremacy, all kinds of stuff. And when I hear sometimes, and I may be wrong, when I hear conservative apologize first and say, okay, I'm not a bad person, and I almost feel like they take responsibility for an action before they go in and say this is the right thing. Because I tell people, okay, look, I'm black, I forgive you. Please don't go in there. The worst thing you can say is, what can we do? It's like nothing, because we need to take responsibility for our own lives. But the thing is, I don't know about that apologetic one. I hear it all the time when people go, I'm not a bad person. And when they say it, they almost say it from a perspective that I'm taking responsibility for what you say about me.
Oh, I know.
When they should. And so I don't know, how do you address that? Because I hear it a lot when they go in, oh, I'm not trying to be mean.
Yeah.
And when you apologize, you basically told the person that I'm the responsible one, but this is what I'm saying. And I'm saying we shouldn't take responsibility at all, because you didn't do anything. Why? I mean, I wasn't a slave. You wasn't a slave master. Why am I mad at you? You know, I still have to be. God, then that would make God unjust. Because if I'm getting punished for something that somebody else is doing for me, then I mean I have no responsibility in that, and I don't believe that. So, you know, how do you address that part?
Well, yeah, I guess there are two parts to the answer there. First of all, what you're dealing with, a person like you having to deal with it. I mean, it's like a false confession, which is one of those, one of those tools of conformity that's pushed, the false confession. And you see that a lot, like on Twitter. Oh, no, I'm not. And then the other thing you're having to deal with is a lot of people say that, hey, if you say you're a good person, that means that you're really guilty. That you really are, part of this whole systemic thing, and so, it's like you got to take what was his name, Farragut's words to heart. Damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead, right? The torpedoes of all of these smear words that I'm talking about, that I mentioned, they're just there to shut you up. So, but how do you do that? Well, again, you have to build this sense of partnering and cohesion and, and also just, like I say, one-on-one, understand that human beings are individuals with their own perspectives, their own backgrounds, their own sufferings, their own experiences, their own sense of humor, personality. I mean, identity politics tries to erase all of that. And what does that do to us as a community? We can't we can't even see each other as human beings. And you bring up as individuals, it reminds me that the Martin Luther King Memorial, since we're on this subject, I don't know how many of you know, I think it was installed in 2011. Well, his most iconic message is nowhere to be seen among the 15 quotes of Martin Luther King. Nowhere will you see the content of one's character. It's not there. And that's what we all remembered and respected about the dream. And it's gone. Why? Well, because I think it's because we're being pushed away from seeing one another as individual human beings. And that is so destructive. And that, of course, is an instrument of isolation.
Hi.
Hi.
Katie Wheeler, Loudoun County Republican Women's Club. I'd like to get your 30,000-foot view of the threat to our current society from Russia versus China.
Oh, okay. Well, my husband, Brian, he's a national security foreign policy expert. Well, with China, I'm going to focus on China here because Russia's just such the Russia talk is just such a mess these days. And of course, I have a master's in Russian and Soviet history. And of course, they instituted a totalitarian system. But I'm looking more at China because so much of the control that so many of the examples that seem to be followed by, I'll just say our leadership today, seem to come from China, particularly the social credit system. And globalists are also very much invested in the idea of a social credit system where your compliance with all of your access to goods and services in China, for example, access to housing, transportation, can't even get on a bus if you don't have a high enough social credit score. So your mobility is affected, everything is affected. We saw reflections of that in the COVID mandates, and we just can't let it happen. And I think it requires a big wake-up call. And that's partly why I wrote this book. Thank you.
If I could ask the last question, Stella, and then we'll talk informally over lunch and book signing. It's a little bit off topic, but not totally. You were at the CIA for 15 years.
More like 10.
Okay. Yeah. That's a while. 7 years you get a pension, right?
I did, yeah.
I got one in the Reagan administration, too. Would you just comment a little about the CIA, maybe then and now? We read a lot about it in connection with the various national discussions, and I'm sure it was quite an experience for you, and what a fascinating area you were in, Russian.
Yeah, and a lot of my focus there was on propaganda and media analysis, but it's interesting. So today, I think a lot of people in this room would agree that like the FBI, the CIA ain't what it used to be or ain't what it was meant to be. I see it as, some people would say the corruption goes way, way, way back. Now, I was there during the Reagan years. We had a president who absolutely was committed, devoted to freedom. But having said that, there were already I experienced a lot of leftist kinds of, especially among analysts, it was kind of like a faculty lounge sort of experience in a lot of ways, where you had senior analysts and even branch chiefs and division chiefs there who were, hated Reagan's evil empire speech, were like, whoa, whoa, whoa. And, but also, we're basically leftist by identity. I mean, it was, so it was already, there was already woke creep way back then. So, you can only, I cannot imagine what it is now. Well, I can imagine what it is now. But anyway, that's about all I have to say on that. But yeah, but if you have more you want to talk about. Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
I have some gifts for you.
Oh, whoa. Whoa.
What an incredible, insightful
Oh,
book
thank you.
and talk, and to help us
Thank
all
you.
be better Americans, better friends, just better people by thinking
you.
it through instead of being quiet. Speaking up.
Thank you.
I have a couple of gifts for you. I have a book that I wrote called How to Raise a Conservative Daughter, personally ascribed to you.
Oh,
And,
thank you.
You probably could have written it. 'cause
Oh,
you-
well, you
you
know, it's interesting. I had 3 sons, but no grandchildren yet, but maybe I will have
Right.
a conservative granddaughter.
There you go.
There you go.
and that-
Yeah.
Parents,
Thank you.
grandparents, everybody. And I have our limited edition coffee mug, and you're
Oh.
going to like this because it has her saying that you quoted, "Courage is the ladder on which all the other virtues mount."
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I
And
will.
appreciate you signing books, and please all of you